They all laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that slips out politely when someone tells a bad joke. No, this was different. This was deep belly laughter, loud and raw, filling every inch of my mom's dining room until it bounced off the old floral wallpaper and echoed in my ears like a taunt. It felt like I was the butt of a joke everyone else had been rehearsing for weeks, except no one had clued me in on the punchline. I sat stiffly at the table, clutching the small box in my lap like it was some kind of lifeline. It was wrapped in delicate pink paper with a satin bow, probably something my mom Margaret picked up from the gift shop downtown, where they sell overpriced candles and glass trinkets. Inside the box were napkins, not the plain kind, of course. These were the fancy sort embroidered along the edges with tiny gold threads, the kind you might pull out for Thanksgiving. But still napkins. I ran my fingertips over the soft paper, tracing the pattern, absent-mindedly pretending to admire them, while my mother's voice pierced through the laughter like a dagger. "Well, Claire, you do clean up after everyone anyway," she said, her grin stretching wide across her face like she had just delivered the joke of the century. The room erupted again. Jessica, my sister, always the star of the show, tilted her head back and laughed in that performative way she had mastered since high school. Uncle Rick let out a snort, slapping his knee like he was at some stand-up show. Even Grandpa Walt, who rarely showed much expression beyond his usual soft nod, chuckled under his breath. I could feel it then, the familiar flush rising up the back of my neck, crawling up to my cheeks, prickling under my skin, until my whole face felt like it was on fire. My throat tightened like someone had tied a rope around it. I tried to swallow the lump that was forming, but it stuck, lodged somewhere deep in my chest. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I heard a faint pop in my ear. Still I said nothing. I couldn't. I sat frozen, my eyes locked on those ridiculous napkins, while the years of slights and dismissals pressed down on me like a heavy, invisible weight. Across from me, Jessica sat with perfect posture, casually flaunting Grandma's gold watch, the same one I used to marvel at when I was little, watching it glint in the sunlight as she brushed my hair and told me stories about the family's old life back in Pennsylvania. Now it sat on Jessica's wrist like it was always hers. It shimmered against her flawless skin, a symbol of something that was always just out of my reach. I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. Was this real? Was I really sitting here, the quiet sister with napkins in her lap while she wore the legacy? I kept my face blank, holding on to the only armor I had left, but inside my mind was spinning, spiraling into the same old questions. Why did this sting so deeply? Why did it always feel like I was the outsider in a family where I should have been seen, heard, valued? I forced my breaths to stay even, but my chest still ached tight and heavy. My hands, which had spent the entire evening clearing plates and serving drinks, trembled as they sat neatly folded in my lap. I gripped them harder, forcing them into stillness, into obedience. The others carried on, as if nothing had happened. Uncle Rick cracked some lame joke about me getting matching gloves next Christmas, and Jessica flicked her hair back over her shoulder, her lips curled into that gleaming, picture-perfect smile. I caught the flicker in her eyes, though, that subtle flash of something worse than disdain, dismissal, like I wasn't even worth mocking anymore. I had always been the one who remembered to bring the cranberry sauce, who arrived early to set the table, who stayed behind to clean up the kitchen no one else dared to touch. I was the one who checked in on Grandpa Walt when everyone else forgot he even existed. The one who sent birthday cards, the one who made the effort quietly in the background, asking for nothing more than a little acknowledgement. But tonight I got a box of napkins and became the centerpiece of their joke. The laughter faded, slowly trailing off like smoke, leaving behind a tension that settled thick in the air, making it hard to breathe. I think for the first time they noticed I wasn't laughing along with them. The room shifted, the mood dipping into an awkward hush, the kind that makes people glance at each other and fidget in their seats, unsure how to fill the silence. That was when something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. I knew I couldn't let this pass. Not again. Without saying a word, I reached into my tote bag, my fingers finding the manila envelope I had carried for weeks. It was creased at the edges from sitting in the bottom of my coat pocket, waiting for a moment I wasn't sure would ever come. But tonight I finally knew. The moment was now. The room hushed into a vacuum of stillness as I laid the envelope gently on the table in front of me. The only sound that dared to speak was the steady tick-tock of Grandpa Walt's ancient wall clock, its rhythm as loud as a heartbeat. Mom's grin faltered, the muscles in her face stiffening as her gaze darted to the envelope. Jessica leaned in, eyebrows arched with theatrical curiosity, like she was bracing for another gag. Uncle Rick cocked his head, squinting at it as if trying to figure out if this was part of some elaborate prank. It wasn't. I looked at each of them slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, savoring the rare power of their unease. I brought something too, I said, my voice steady, calm, and for the first time all night loud enough to command the entire room. And just like that, the laughter died. The room felt colder in the aftermath. Or maybe that was just me finally noticing the chill that had always been there, lurking beneath the forced smiles and hollow toasts. But before I tell you what was inside that envelope, you need to know how we got here. And if any part of this feels familiar to you, if you've ever sat quietly at a table where no one really saw you or carried a weight you weren't supposed to speak of, I hope you'll consider sticking around. Stories like this one, stories about the unspoken, the invisible, the reckoning moments that shift everything. That's what I share here. So if this resonates, go ahead and hit that like button or subscribe. Not for me, but for every quiet voice that's been waiting for their moment to be heard. I'm Claire Sanders, 28. The youngest daughter, though, you wouldn't know it by the way they treat me, like the family's unpaid intern. The quiet one, they call me, as if it's some charming quirk. But in my family, quiet is just a polite way of saying she keeps her mouth shut. It's easier that way for them, at least. For as long as I could remember, I wore the invisible badge of the fixer, the one who swept up the messes, both the spilled wine on the white tablecloth and the words that cut too deep but were brushed off as jokes. I patched holes in the family's brittle facade, soothed the fraying edges, swallowed the petty slights with a smile I'd practiced in the mirror until it barely wobbled. We were raised in a house where Jessica, my older sister, was the tempest, beautiful, dazzling, impossible to ignore, and I was the one sent in after the winds died down, broom in hand. Jessica was the radiant star, the one who collected trophies and accolades like seashells on a beach. Straight A's, full scholarships, a trendy online business she built from scratch, always with a photo-ready smile. She kept Mom Margaret Sanders updated on every step of her journey, ensuring every triumph echoed through the family group chat. I wasn't exactly failing at life. I worked in nonprofit accounting, a stable, noble career if you asked anyone else. Last year I scraped and saved enough to buy myself a modest condo, a place all my own. But in our family, milestones like mine faded into the background noise. When I texted the family chat about my promotion, Mom sent me a thumbs-up emoji, as if she couldn't be bothered to find the words. When Jessica appeared on some mid-tier podcast, there was a full-on family brunch complete with mimosas and homemade cinnamon rolls. It had become a rhythm, a cruel, exhausting one that wore grooves into my soul until I forgot it was supposed to feel different. This dinner, it was Jessica's birthday weekend. A family affair, small, intimate, orchestrated with the precision only Mom could manage. In the same old house with its creaking floors, chipped dinnerware, and the heavy, suffocating air of unresolved tension tucked behind every forced smile. When I arrived, the welcome was as hollow as ever. A one-armed hug from Mom, a half-hearted wave from Jessica, already absorbed in scrolling through her phone, and Grandpa Walt offering me the seat next to him with his usual quiet nod. Walt never said much, but there was always something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition that told me he saw through the noise, saw me even if he never put it into words. Over the last year, as his health had waned, I'd become his shadow, driving him to doctor's appointments, managing his medications, taking him for walks in the park when his legs allowed. No one asked how it was going. No one really cared. "Thanks, Claire," they'd say absently, like I was doing them a favor, not caring for the man who had once cradled them in his arms. That night unfolded like every other. I set the table. Of course I did arrange the candles, just so brought a bottle of red I knew Mom favored, though she'd never say thank you. I even stayed up the night before baking Jessica's favorite cake, lemon with raspberry filling. No one noticed I brought it in a cardboard box because I'd rushed over straight from the office, still in my work blazer, my hair scraped into a tight bun, like the diligent assistant I had unintentionally become. Then, like a bad joke from a play I never auditioned for, it happened. Mom handed Jessica the gold watch. Grandma's watch. The one she used to let me try on when I was a girl, sitting cross-legged on her bed, dreaming of the day it might be mine. Jessica laughed, sliding it onto her wrist as if it had always been destined for her, as if I wasn't even in the room. And me, I sat there the proud owner of a box of napkins. Napkins. Fancy, embroidered, utterly useless napkins. But that envelope, that manila envelope, crumpled in the corner of my bag. That was my line in the sand. It was the first thing I ever did that wasn't part of the script they had written for me since childhood. I had held on to it for weeks, unsure if I'd ever find the courage to let it see the light of day. But something inside me splintered that night, not out of bitterness, but out of a cold, clean clarity that no one was going to acknowledge my existence unless I forced them to look. So I did what I'd been waiting to do. I placed the envelope on the table right there in front of them all. Because this wasn't a birthday dinner anymore. This was a reckoning. They didn't open it right away. I imagine they thought it was just another Claire thing, some overly responsible paperwork or a boring budget spreadsheet, maybe another polite gesture they could laugh off. But I wasn't smiling. I hadn't smiled since that box of napkins landed in my lap like a punchline to a joke I'd heard 1,000 times. Mom glanced at the envelope, then up at me, her mouth opening slightly as if she was about to protest or deflect, but she thought better of it. Jessica arched an eyebrow, the gold watch glimmering on her wrist as she twirled it mockingly and muttered under her breath. "Okay, dramatic much," Uncle Rick chuckled again, the uncomfortable kind of laugh people force out when they don't know what else to do. I said nothing. I didn't need to. I folded my hands calmly in my lap, holding my posture like a fortress. They didn't know what I knew. They had no inkling of what I had done. Let me take you back to that rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky hangs heavy and gray, and even the air feels like it's pressing down on your chest. I had taken Grandpa Walt to his cardiology appointment. He had been unusually quiet during the drive, his gnarled hands resting limply in his lap, his gaze fixed on the water streaking down the passenger side window. When we parked, he finally turned to me, his voice gravelly from age yet unshaken in its sincerity. "You know, I trust you, don't you, Claire?" I nodded, puzzled. "Of course, Grandpa." He let out a long, weary sigh, staring ahead like he couldn't bear to look at me. "I want to change my will." For a moment, I thought I'd heard him wrong. I asked him why, gently unsure if I wanted to know the answer. His reply hit like a gut punch I hadn't seen coming. "Because I've watched how they treat you. And I've watched how you treat them. Only one of those things deserves to be remembered." His words settled into my bones heavy and undeniable. So I helped him. I took time off work, sat with him through every tedious legal consultation, made sure everything was done by the book, witnessed, notarized, and sealed in silence. He left me the house, the very house we sat in that night, the house everyone else assumed would be split or sold, the house where I used to steal cookies from the jar, curl up with Grandpa during storms, later scrub the floors no one else bothered to clean. They had no idea. I hadn't told them. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because deep down I didn't want to feel like I had to win something just to matter. But that night, the laughter, the napkins, the cruel dismissal disguised as tradition, it hardened something inside me that had been soft for far too long. It wasn't just about the gift, it was about the message. You're the helper, the extra, the background character in your own family. I sat there blinking slowly every forgotten birthday, every overlooked achievement, every time I had stepped in to rescue them, playing on a loop in my mind like some cruel family highlight reel. So when I said calm, and even I brought something too, it wasn't rage speaking, it was resolve. They stared, frozen. Not a sip of wine, not a glance toward the cake. Jessica, for the first time that evening, looked uncomfortable. Mom's forehead wrinkled in confusion. Uncle Rick shifted awkwardly in his seat. They knew this wasn't napkins. And in that moment, I realized this had never been about revenge. It was about being seen. About finally stepping into the center of a room where I had been invisible for far too long. They had laughed at me, but I would make sure they wouldn't be laughing much longer. I let the silence stretch like a slow, creeping fog thickening, until it pressed on their skin, the way it had always pressed on mine. I wasn't going to rush this moment. No, this time they could sit in the discomfort, taste the bitterness of not knowing. For once I was the one holding the cards, and I intended to play them slowly. They sat there suspended in a silence that stretched on so long it began to hum in my ears, vibrating in the same space where their laughter had so recently echoed like cruel applause. The stillness filled the room like smoke, dense and suffocating, as though they were now tasting the bitter uncertainty I had lived with for years. years spent wondering where or if I belonged in this family that had always found it easier to overlook me. Mom was the first to break the tension, clearing her throat in a sound that carried no authority, only hesitation, her earlier amusement curdling into something brittle and cautious. Claire, she said, her voice stripped of its usual sharpness, replaced now by a fragile tone that made me wonder if she already understood on some subconscious level that whatever sat inside that envelope would change everything. What is this? I met her gaze squarely, not with the blazing anger I might have once carried, but with something quieter, deeper clarity. It's from Grandpa, I said the words, leaving my lips soft but steady, weighted with months of carrying them alone. Something he asked me to handle, a few months back. Jessica scoffed, flipping her wrist so the gold watch caught the light in a flash of defiance. Oh, please, she sneered, her voice shrill and sharp, the sound of a woman desperate to keep control of a conversation she didn't understand. What is it, his grocery list? I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. That kind of petty deflection never came from a place of strength, it came from fear. And though Jessica would never admit it, she knew that too. Across the table, Grandpa Walt shifted slow and deliberate, like the old wooden chair beneath him protested the movement. All night he'd remained a silent figure in the background, but now he raised his head, and in his weathered, weary face there was a flicker of something resolute. She helped me with everything he said, simply his voice gravelly, but clear enough to cut through the dense fog of denial that filled the room. His gaze swept over Mom, then Jessica, finally resting on me. When I couldn't drive, when I couldn't think straight, when I didn't want to admit I was scared. His words settled over the table like an unexpected snowfall, soft but inescapable, blanketing every dish, every glass, every unspoken resentment. Uncle Rick scratched at the back of his neck, his fingers grazing the thinning patch of hair there as if hoping to wake himself from this unraveling nightmare. So what he mumbled, his tone a fragile shield of sarcasm, "This is some medical paperwork." A bitter laugh almost escaped me, not from amusement, but from the absurdity of how deep their refusal to see reality ran. "No," I said, letting the words stretch long enough to make them shift in their seats. "It's legal. It's the updated will." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating in the hollow space where their laughter had once ruled. Jessica's mouth fell open, her confidence cracking at the edges. Mom leaned back in her chair, blinking rapidly, as if the documents on the table might transform into something less devastating if she looked at them long enough. Uncle Rick's chewing stopped mid-bite, the tension in his jaw freezing him in place. "You changed his will?" Jessica's voice broke into a pitch I hadn't heard before, tight-high laced with panic. I held her gaze calm and unwavering. "No," I corrected softly but firmly. "Grandpa changed it. I helped him make sure it was done right, because he asked me to." Without fanfare, I reached for the envelope, peeled it open, and slid the neatly organized papers across the worn wood of the dining table. I had highlighted the key sections, carefully marked Grandpa's wishes, the witness statements, the notarized signatures, everything transparent, nothing hidden, just the truth finally captured in black and white. The house, his remaining savings, his personal letters, instructions for his care, even a note written in his hand explaining why he had made the changes. I didn't know if they would read it, if they could bear to see the words, but I needed them to sit with it, to see it, to feel the weight of it in their hands. Mom stared down at the pages like they were written in a language she had never learned, her face, draining of color, lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. I didn't know he was thinking about this," she whispered finally, her voice brittle and small. "That's because no one asked," I said quietly, the words slipping out softer than I intended, but they still cut through the room like glass. No one saw him. No one saw me. They never had. And it wasn't anger filling me anymore. It was something sadder, deeper, a grieving not for what was lost, but for everything that had never existed to begin with. The approval I had spent a lifetime chasing. The affection I had been conditioned to believe needed to be earned. That night I didn't shout. I didn't beg them to see me. I simply told them the truth. I never wanted the house. I said, my voice as steady as the old clock ticking in the background. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered. Jessica leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest in a protective shield, her glare sharpening into daggers. "So this is your way of getting back at us?" I turned to her, really looked at her, stripping away the armor she wore like a second skin. "No," I said, my voice cool, almost gentle. This is my way of stepping out of the shadow you all were perfectly happy leaving me in. And with that, I stood. I didn't need to stay for their reactions, not immediately. I had said what needed to be said. I had claimed the one thing they had never offered me willingly space. And in that moment, as I stood back from the table, letting the heavy silence speak louder than I ever could, I felt something I had never felt before. Power. I didn't storm out. That would have been too loud, too dramatic, too easy. Instead, I moved toward the doorway, my hands lightly folded, letting the silence do what my voice never could, force them to feel something. But I didn't leave. I lingered near the doorway, watching as they slowly, almost unwillingly, leaned forward, their fingers trembling as they unfolded the papers I had placed before them. Grandpa's signature gleamed from the pages, clear, deliberate, leaving no room for argument. Jessica was the first to break. This can't be real," she whispered, her voice cracking, exposing the fragile, terrified girl beneath the polished veneer. Why would he leave you the house and everything else? What about Mom? What about me? I could feel my heart settle into a steady rhythm. It wasn't triumph pulsing through me. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, something closer to peace, a stillness I hadn't known in years. Grandpa lifted his gaze, his voice stronger now, the weight of his truth anchoring every word. Because she earned it. The words fell into the room like a stone tossed into still water ripples, reaching every corner, every heart. "I've seen how Claire shows up," he said, his eyes softening, even as his voice held firm. She didn't wait for someone to ask her to care. She just did. She never demanded recognition. But that doesn't mean she didn't deserve it. Mom opened her mouth, but no words came. She stared at the table, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping themselves tightly as though bracing for a storm that had already arrived. "I'm not saying you're not my daughter, Maggie," Grandpa Walt said, turning toward my mother with a slow, deliberate weight in his voice, as if the words had been waiting a long time to be spoken aloud. But Claire was there when it counted. The silence in the room grew denser with each syllable, like layers of dust being disturbed in a long-forgotten attic. Every hospital visit, he continued the words, scraping slightly against his throat. Every form I couldn't understand. Every meal I couldn't cook. You all sent flowers. She showed up. There was no bitterness in his tone, only the kind of tired honesty that settles in a man who's outlived the illusions he once needed to survive. And somehow the quiet gravity of his words struck harder than any speech I could have given, because they weren't mine. They were his. And they were true. I turned toward my mother, then almost instinctively, searching her face the way a child might look for a sliver of warmth in a winter wind. I wanted to find something guilt-shock, even a flicker of shame, but all I found was a blankness that stung worse than rage. Her expression was tight, unmoving, like someone caught reading a headline they didn't want to believe. Jessica, meanwhile, was unraveling at the seams. Her hands clutched her wine glass with a white-knuckled grip, her eyes glossy, darting around the table like she was hunting for a lifeline that no longer existed. Her poise was gone. The confident tilt of her chin had collapsed into something raw and unsettled. "You didn't tell anyone," she spat suddenly, her voice high-pitched, brittle. "You just let us sit here like fools." I met her gaze, holding it not with defiance, but with a quiet, searing finality. "I let you treat me the way you always have," I said, each word steady as a pulse. "The only difference this time is that now there's something in writing to prove it." Uncle Rick gave a low whistle, shaking his head slowly as he leaned back in his chair and rubbed the stubble along his jaw. "Well, damn," he muttered, with something between admiration and horror stretching across his face. "Guess you were always the quiet one, huh?" I let that sit for a moment, savoring the weight of it before answering. "Not anymore." No one laughed. The room had lost the buoyancy it once held. Now it was anchored in something heavier, something real. I looked down at the table, still cluttered with the remnants of the evening empty wine glasses, crumb-smeared plates, the uneaten corner of the lemon raspberry cake I had baked. And there it was beside my place, setting the box of napkins still unopened, as pristine and useless as when it first landed in my lap. For a moment I considered leaving it there to rot into metaphor, to let it become the symbol they had unwittingly made it. But instead I reached out and picked it up, holding it carefully, almost reverently, as though it were a trophy, earned through sheer endurance. I turned to my mother one last time, meeting her eyes with a calm I hadn't known I was capable of. I'm not angry anymore, I said. I'm just done asking for what should have been given freely. For a brief, flickering instant, our eyes locked. And in that space, one breath wide, no more I saw it. Not remorse, not apology, but something faintly resembling recognition. A quiet, blinking acknowledgement that perhaps for the first time she truly saw me. It was enough. I turned toward the hallway, the napkin box tucked beneath my arm like a strange emblem of all the years I had given unseen. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, and I was almost to the threshold when Grandpa's voice called after me. You'll stay in touch, won't you? I paused and looked back at him. His face was gentle lines deepened by age and love, and I smiled soft and genuine. Always, I said. And I meant it. For him, I always would. But for the rest of them, this was the day the lesson was finally learned. The quiet ones are not weak. Sometimes we're just waiting for the right moment to speak, and when we do, it's loud enough to echo. The house the next morning was different. Not just the usual stillness that follows a family gathering, but a quiet with weight behind it, intentional, reflective, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stayed the night in the guest room, not because I needed to, but because Grandpa had asked. He didn't want to say goodbye just yet, and truthfully, neither did I. I rose early as I always do and padded barefoot into the kitchen to make coffee. The air was cool touched with the scent of dew and something earthy like old wood and memory. Mug in hand, I stepped out onto the back porch, the one where Grandma used to grow her herbs and hummingbirds used to dance around the feeder she hung every spring. The planter boxes were there still, but most of the greenery had withered away brittle and forgotten. I ran my fingers gently along a dried rosemary stem, crumbling some of it between my fingers. It smelled faintly of what once was. And I wondered, as the pieces fell away, how many things in this family had faded, not from time, but from neglect. A creak behind me broke the morning quiet. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Mom stepped out slowly, her sweater wrapped tightly around her body, as if shielding herself from more than just the morning chill. Her eyes were puffy, not red, but swollen in that way that speaks more to sleeplessness than tears. The kind of tired that seeps from realizing something you can't unknow. She sat across from me and we said nothing at first. Just listened to the birds singing their simple songs, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the slow awakening of a world that didn't yet know everything had changed. After a while she spoke. I didn't know you felt that way. She said, her voice low and unsteady, as though each word had to claw its way past the decades of silence. I sipped my coffee. The bitterness was grounding. You didn't ask, I replied gently, not cruelly, just honestly. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden porch floor. I guess I thought you were fine. You never made a fuss. You just handled things. I did, I said, because someone had to. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was stripped down bare, finally free of the pretense we'd both been trained to wear. Then she looked at me, really looked, and for once didn't look away. I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't know yet if I fully believed her. But it was the first time I'd heard those words from her in as long as I could remember. And for now, that had to mean something. Later that afternoon, as the house settled into a hush, heavy with things left unsaid, I packed my things. The motions were slow, deliberate, as though each item I folded into my overnight bag carried a history I was finally willing to leave behind. When I zipped it shut, Grandpa Walt was waiting for me at the door. His frame smaller than I remembered, though his embrace was as solid and grounding as ever. You did the right thing, sweetheart, he whispered into my ear, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of an entire lifetime's worth of knowing. Those words clung to me like armor, something I could press against my heart in the quieter, lonelier moments that would inevitably follow. Jessica didn't say goodbye. She sat rigid at the table, lips drawn tight, eyes fixed on her untouched glass of wine, as if ignoring me might erase the entire evening from memory. But her silence no longer carved through me like it once had. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was standing in her shadow. I had stepped into my own light, and her refusal to acknowledge it only made that light shine brighter. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of our family life adjusted not drastically, but enough that I noticed the subtle shifts, the edges softening in places I hadn't expected. Uncle Rick, ever the sideline observer, sent me a Facebook message accompanied by a looping gif of someone raising a glass. Respect it, read. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the small, crooked smile that tugged at my lips. Mom began texting more often, not the sterile logistical check-ins about birthdays or casserole duty, but real human messages. She asked how work was going. Once she even called late at night just to say goodnight. Small gestures, yes, but after years of feeling invisible, even the smallest crack in the armor felt like fresh air. Jessica and I, however, remained on opposite shores of a widening gulf. Weeks turned into a month, and the silence between us stretched without apology or attempt at repair. And strangely, I found I was more than okay with that. Some distances are necessary. Some boundaries are not drawn in anger, but in love for yourself. The house, now legally mine, felt different too. Not just in paperwork, but in spirit. It belonged to me in a way it never had before, filled now, not with ghosts of old resentments, but with my presence, my choices. Every weekend, I returned to visit Grandpa Walt, and we sat side by side on the back porch, talking about anything but the past. The past we'd both learned didn't need to be relived or polished into some gleaming lie. It simply needed to be seen for what it was, and then left where it belonged. If there was one thing I carried away from that night, etched into the marrow of my bones, it was this: silence is not the same as peace. Being the one who held it all together didn't make me noble or selfless if it came at the cost of my own worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to beg for a seat at the table, but to build your own table and invite yourself to it. I never wanted the house, not the money, not the hollow recognition they tossed around like confetti. I only wanted to know that the things I did, the small, quiet, steady acts of love and care, mattered. And now finally I knew they did. I didn't need their permission to believe it. And to anyone who's ever sat at the edge of a table like that, holding the weight of invisible labor while others bask in the spotlight, let me tell you this: you are not small. You are not forgettable. You are not merely the one who sweeps up the crumbs. You are the one who knows where everything goes, including your own worth. And sometimes all it takes is one truth bravely spoken to change everything. If my story feels like your story, even in the smallest way, know that you're not alone. I invite you to share your story too. Leave a message. Tell me if you've ever been the one holding it all together quietly while the world looked the other way. I see you. And your story matters too. And maybe there's someone in your life who needs to hear this. Someone who's always been steady, always been there, the one who never asks for much. Share this with them. Let them know they are seen. And if this story touched you, if it sparked something inside, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps these stories find the people who need them most. And if you're new here, or maybe you've been sitting in the background watching quietly, I hope you'll subscribe, turn on the notifications, and join me for more stories like this. Stories of family, of identity, of healing, of finally finding your voice. Because sometimes the quietest voices are the ones carrying the most powerful stories of all. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.